If Gerald Ford had won the 1976 presidential election, then Bob Dole Robert would have been elected vice president, and President Gerald Ford and Vice President Nelson Rockefeller would have finished out the rest of Richard Nixon Spiro Agnew's second term. And come January 20th, Nelson Rockefeller would leave forever, and Bob Dole Robert would be inaugurated as a new vice president, and Gerald Ford would take the presidential oath of office again. And Gerald Ford's policies would not change during the new term. Gerald Ford would continue aiding and abetting the Indonesian genocide of East Timor. Gerald Ford would continue support for the state of Israel. And Gerald Ford would continue support for the Shah of Iran. Now, in Afghanistan, when the People's Democratic Party of Afghanistan takes over and forms the communist government, Gerald Ford would do the same thing that Jimmy Carter did in real life, whereas Gerald Ford would probably also fund and arm the Mujahideen, just like Jimmy Carter and Ronald Reagan did. And Gerald Ford would try to topple the government of Afghanistan, but that would backfire because the Soviet Union would invade Afghanistan. And so Gerald Ford would do exactly what Jimmy Carter and Ronald Reagan did, and he would use the Mujahideen as a weapon against the Soviet Union and continue arming and funding the Mujahideen. Now, after the Iranian Revolution, Gerald Ford would, of course, try to protect the Shah, his puppet. And so Gerald Ford would probably still give amnesty to the Shah, and Gerald Ford would probably want to topple the Grand Ayatollah. And so Gerald Ford would be very hawkish with the Islamic Republic of Iran, and the Iranians would still take the hostages. And so Gerald Ford might be even more reckless than Jimmy Carter and maybe try to invade Iran and do a full-on war and try more regime change. But in this case, the Iranians would have rallied around the Grand Ayatollah, so that would be very hard. Although Gerald Ford maybe would still use Saddam Hussein of Iraq to invade Iran and do the Iraq-Iran war. So Gerald Ford would be very hawkish and just not very different from Jimmy Carter and Ronald Reagan on the foreign policies. Now, Gerald Ford, much like Richard Nixon, hated the New Deal and he wanted to destroy it. But of course, ironically, it was Jimmy Carter who started all the deregulation and corporatization of the economy. Although actually Richard Nixon and Gerald Ford had already started that. So it was Richard Nixon, Gerald Ford, Jimmy Carter who were already doing all of that. And Jimmy Carter who came in with the deregulation on steroids. And then Ronald Reagan came in with the deregulation on more steroids. And the four of them pretty much destroyed the New Deal era. But the point is, Gerald Ford would have those terrible policies that would destroy the New Deal. And so from his terrible handling of foreign policy to his horrible handling of domestic policy, Gerald Ford would be a very unpopular president, and of course the people would still have a grudge against him for pardoning Richard Nixon. So Gerald Ford's approval rating would go down probably to like George W. Bush levels, and at the end he would just be so unpopular that all the other Republican candidates would be actively distancing themselves for him, and his midterm election in 1978 would go horribly. And so by the time 1980 rolls around, Bob Dole would obviously try to run for president, but he would be at a disadvantage because Gerald Ford would be so unpopular, and maybe Ronald Reagan would try to run for president again. And so it's hard to say who would win the Republican nomination in that case because Bob Dole would have the leverage of having been vice president, although that probably wouldn't help him. So let's say Ronald Reagan was the nomination, but Ronald Reagan would just still propose the same policies as Gerald Ford and say, less government, government bad, and just cry about that stuff. And so it really depends on what happens on the Democratic side, because on the Democratic side, in 1980, who would be running in this scenario? Would it be Jimmy Carter again? Would it be Fritz Mondale? Would it be Jesse Jackson? Would it be George McGovern giving another shot at it or something? So it depends on who wins on the Democratic side. But of course, if an actual New Dealer won on the Democratic side, then they could promise to bring the country back to the New Deal era. And that would be a winning message, and they would probably win. Although even if it were just a trashy, just corporate Democrat running, they would probably still win because Gerald Ford and the Republicans would be so damaged and unpopular. So if Gerald Ford had won in 1976, his policies would have still stayed the same in that next term, and he would have done horribly, and it would have been terrible for the Republicans moving forward because they would be absolutely sick of him. And Gerald Ford was not as good of a liar as Ronald Reagan. Ronald Reagan is a very bad, very manipulative, very good at lying and gaslighting and tricking people, whereas Gerald Ford does not have those same skills. So Gerald Ford probably would have just ended in disaster, even if he had won in 1976. And it's a good thing that he didn't, but Jimmy Carter was not very good, to say the least. Jimmy Carter, with all of his deregulation and very hawkish foreign policy. Of course, Jimmy Carter has been rehabilitated into some angel saint, but if you actually look at his policies, that's something else.